Hey everyone, I hope you're learning your way around the Blackboard site and getting settled into the course here. So the second lecture I've titled Philosophy as Language. And I want to say a couple of introductory things about why I've called it that before I turn to briefly going over the Philosophical Vocabulary Lexicon, which you have a quiz on due tomorrow night. So philosophy as language, why am I calling this lecture that? Well, in a lot of ways, learning philosophy, learning how to do philosophy, can be like learning a language. We have terms that we use in philosophy that you've probably never heard before, that you need to start getting used to using. There are also, perhaps problematically, a lot of philosophical terms that we have that we use in specific and technical ways, but that also have a meaning in just ordinary casual speech. And so you have to go through the mental labor of disambiguating the way that you're used to just hearing a kind of regular term and the specific philosophical significance that it has. So that's the ways in which learning philosophy can be like learning a language, but perhaps more interestingly, at least in the sense that it actually raises some philosophical questions for us to start thinking about, is the fact that, well, language itself structures our minds in some important ways, right? Language structures our ways of thinking and ways of reasoning in some important ways. For a lot of human history, that was language in the sense of speech or writing was really the only way that we had to think, to reason through our problems. You could say now that we have certain kind of scientific computer languages, logic, mathematical ways of expressing ourselves that can achieve certain kinds of truths that are not accessible to ordinary spoken or written language, but nonetheless, we're not all theoretical physicists or mathematicians, and spoken language, written language is still the primary way in which we solve human problems, right, in which human reasoning takes place. So there are some important philosophical consequences to that, or at least some questions that are raised by it. Specifically, what's the relationship between the way that language makes us think, between the way that language makes us express ourselves, and the sort of objective real world that we are expressing ourselves about, the real world that we are using language to describe. There are many ways in which some basic kind of metaphysical assumptions that we have about reality are either are embedded in language or expressed in language. I'll give you a couple of examples. So think first of all about the fundamental difference between subject and object, and those are a couple of terms that come up on the philosophical vocabulary lexicon that you have. Subject and object. So this describes a fundamental distinction within reality, right? You essentially think of yourself as a subject looking out on a world of objects, right? The subject is the viewer or the active thing. The object is the thing that is perceived or dealt with. It's the passive thing. Well, that's something that you learn from very early grammar, right? Long before you ever started thinking about philosophy, you learn that a sentence has a subject and that verbs have objects. You learn that a subject is the thing that does something in a sentence, and that an object is the thing that has something done to it in a sentence. So what does that mean for our relation to reality, or for the relation between our cognitive apparatus and external reality? More specifically, what is the causal relationship pertaining there between those two things? What is the causal relationship? And again, causality, causation, one of the terms you can refer to on the lexicon that I gave you. But what's the causal relationship between the fact that our language is structured in this way and reality itself? Do we perceive reality to have this division between ourselves as subjects and the objects out there in the world because of the language that we've inherited? Which, you know, and remember, of course, that language is a cultural inheritance. It's something that has a history that's formed over time, not something that's just kind of dropped and implanted into us from nowhere, right? So there's a lot of historical residue that kind of comes with that, and to what extent is that historical residue shaping the most fundamental metaphysical ways that we understand reality? One more example, just to drive this point home before moving on to looking over that the lexicon itself. Think about the structure of time. the fundamental structure of time that you're used to, divided into past, present, and future. There's not much way to think beyond that, right? And we can't really come up with a better rubric for making sense of our lives, for making sense of time and the way that we move through it. There is past, present, and future. But just like the subject-object distinction, that's a distinction that exists in our language, raising the question, does it come from our language? Does it come from a kind of cultural inheritance, which language is? Or is it a basic and real feature of the world that our language just accurately and felicitously expresses? Both of these questions are complicated if you start to look outside of the English language, outside of especially European languages and languages that I'm more accustomed to, that most likely you're more accustomed to, because other languages outside of those have different ways of expressing subject and object. Other languages have different ways of expressing time, the divisions of time. So the fact that other cultures, other people might understand these basic metaphysical things in different ways raises a question about the universality of some of these most important, most unquestioned facts about our experience of reality. Okay, that's all I wanted to say in terms of contextualizing and justifying why I'm talking about philosophy and language here. So now I just want to turn to briefly going over the worksheet that I gave you, which I hope is helpful and a good way to start us off with a kind of baseline of common understanding. That's the point here. I don't expect you to memorize every word of this worksheet. I don't expect you to profoundly understand all of the distinctions and terms on here. I'm trying to just give us a place to start. Usually, I think I mentioned this in an email or somewhere, usually when I teach in a classroom, you have time to kind of get students used to speaking the language of philosophy. You have time to gradually get them used to using words in a way that they're not used to using them. We don't have that luxury in this online setting and in this short 1-month class, so I'm trying to overcome that obstacle in part by these means. So, at the risk of boring you, I'm just going to go over quickly the worksheet, the Philosophical Vocabulary Lexicon. I've divided this into 3 sections. First, the just 5 usual divisions of philosophy: epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, logic, political philosophy. Just 2 things I want to emphasize about these. I'm not going to go over each term by itself. First, to reiterate, this is not it. Philosophy can potentially cover everything. There is a philosophy of fill in the blank, right, of just basically anything that you want to think about philosophically. This is just kind of a traditional way of breaking it down, all right? The second thing I want to say about the 5 divisions here is just that the boundaries between them can be quite fuzzy. So there are a lot of questions, a lot of areas of inquiry that don't strictly concern one of these 5 areas to the exclusion of the others. A couple of examples along those lines. Well, I was just talking about the relationship between the way that we understand the world and the way that the world really is, right? What does that distinction sound like to you? That's the difference between epistemology and metaphysics, the first 2 terms that you have on the worksheet here. Epistemology is about our minds, metaphysics is about the world. But those 2 things and the problems that arise about the relationship between those 2 things, our minds and the world, are pretty closely interconnected. You almost immediately start talking about one as soon as you start talking about the other. Think for a moment about the relationship between ethics and political philosophy. Right? Ethics has to do with our values, with what we think is right, with what kinds of character we want to encourage. Well, those values, those feelings, they probably have some kind of origin in the kind of state that we live in, the kind of society that we live in, because the kind of people that we are is shaped in part by the kind of society that we grow up in. You could also turn that question around and make the same point going the other way, that the kind of state, the kind of society we create is some expression of certain values that we have, certain things that we think are more important to emphasize than other values. Right? So you can see how very quickly the divisions of philosophy start to kind of bleed into each other and the separations between them to break down. The next 5 terms, reason, concept, abstraction, distinction, causation, I've called processes of, or mental faculties involved in philosophizing. I want to say a couple of things about each of these. This category of terms on the sheet, I mentioned a minute ago that one of the difficulties of learning philosophy is that often there are terms that have a kind of significance in everyday language that have a different and more technical significance within philosophical language. A lot of characteristic terms like that show up in this section of the list here. So reason in particular, I want to just emphasize that you should think of reason as a power, as a faculty. And faculty is something that could have been on this list, right? This list is very finite. There's a lot more that I could have added to it, but I'm trying to keep it manageable. Reason is a faculty, meaning it's something that you have the ability to do just by virtue of being the kind of thing that you are, at least potentially, and that's an important distinction. At least potentially, if you are human, you have the capacity to reason or to learn how to reason. Aristotle actually thought that reason was what makes us truly special as humans, is what defines us as a species in distinction to any other kind of species, right? So reason, concept. All I want to say about the term concept is that this, more than possibly any other, is the term that in student writing gets used sloppily, right? Think if you are starting to write or to say the concept of. If you're starting to write a sentence that involves, you know, the concept of the state, the concept of justice, are you really talking about the concept of it, or are you talking about the thing, right? Are you talking about the concept, or are you talking about the thing, right? If I say, I'm going to go to the store and buy some bread, I'm not talking about the concept of bread. I'm talking about the actual bread that I want to get. Right? There's a difference, and it's important to keep those distinctions separate and to challenge yourself to ask, which are you really talking about? The concept is the mental representation of the thing, the existence that a certain thing has, the significance that a certain thing has as it appears in your mind. Again, this already raises philosophical questions, right? What the relationship is exactly between your mental representation of a thing and that thing itself is a big question that the terms themselves don't answer for you. But nonetheless, it's important to keep the distinction separate. Concept and thing are different, right? Abstraction and distinction you can think of as sort of inverse processes. Abstraction, let me just say about it that this is a term that has a certain significance within ordinary language. You know, you often hear people say, like, well, you're just being abstract. Or that's a really abstract argument. You're not really talking about anything meaningful. It often has, the term abstract in regular language often has a kind of pejorative sense to it, right? Stop being so abstract. Say something concrete. That prejudice doesn't exist in philosophy. Abstraction is very important to philosophers. We wouldn't be able to operate without it. More, perhaps meaningfully than that even, is that abstraction is important for your basic ability to operate and function in the world. Abstraction is necessary for your ability to comprehend the world. And that's because, as I say on the worksheet here, abstraction is what generates concepts. Concepts are a result of the process of abstraction. And the process of moving from individual experiences and encounters with things at the kind of sensory level to the formation of concepts that become categories that allow you to organize things within your perception and understanding of the world usefully and meaningfully, none of that's possible without the activity of abstraction. Moving from particular individual cases to the generation of general categories, general concepts, general guidelines. Right? So abstraction is nothing to be demeaned in philosophy. It's actually necessary for what we do. Right? Distinction, as I said, operates in kind of an inverse way. I mean, abstraction is the formation of categories from particular things, from specific things. Distinction is the separation of categories from more general categories, from broader categories, right? So in a sense it kind of operates in the opposite direction from the process of abstraction. If you start paying attention to it, whenever you hear anybody engaged in kind of high-level arguments, whether it be philosophical or maybe, you know, on TV watching people talk about politics or something like that, A whole lot of what goes on in argumentation is the act of distinction. To make a distinction in argument is to say, well, you're using a term in a way that's too general. You're using a term that is that pretends to cover a certain category of things, but that we need to break off a particular part of that category in order to really appreciate the situation at hand. That's what distinction does, and if you'll notice, that's what arguers are doing a whole lot of the time when they argue. Right? So it's an important philosophical operation. Causation, I think there's enough of a description of here, and it's a term that I'll bring up a lot throughout this class. I want to really emphasize causal explanation and causal understanding as central to philosophical argumentation. We have plenty of time to think through that. I'm going to try to get to the end here. Lastly, two sets of distinctions that come up frequently in philosophical inquiry: normative versus descriptive, subject versus object. I've already said a few things about subject and object, just kind of along the way here. Normative versus descriptive, you can also find these terms in like sociology and in anthropology and in ethics. These are not even necessarily just philosophical terms. They're just terms that come up a lot. So normative means if something should be a certain way, I think the world should be this way. Description means, or descriptive means, the world is this way. Right? It's not about my intentions, it's not about my values, it's just about trying to objectively describe the way that things are. So the last thing that I just want to say, which these two final terms, or these two final pairings, I should say, bring up, is that very often in philosophy, terms don't really have much significance or much use outside of the oppositions in which they appear, or the pairs in which they appear. So notice how many of the terms that we've talked about already exist as halves of a pair. Right? Subject, object, abstraction, distinction, normative, descriptive, a variety of things. The point here being just that we're very often in philosophy talking about relationships between terms more than we are talking about terms in themselves. And very often terms kind of generate their own opposites. So I mean, if we only had the category of description, it wouldn't be very long before someone came up with the category of normativity, because it just seems to be suggested by it, right? The term subject, as soon as you start talking about what a subject is or what it does, you start talking about the objects that it perceives. They just go together conceptually. So philosophy, just the final point to drive things home here, we're very often talking about relations between terms more than we are talking about terms by themselves or in themselves. Okay, thanks for your time.